Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm just letting the participants trickle in. Do let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. Welcome, welcome. Wow, numbers really climbing. That's exciting. Do let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. Wow, lots and lots of people. That's brilliant. And from all over. And so, yeah, warm welcome to this first WSET global webinar of the new year, all about natural wine. My name's Anjali. I'll introduce myself properly in a second, but just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please do answer them. Please do write them down on the Q&A function. This session is going to be recorded and will be available to watch via the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. I think we will get started. There is such a lot to get through for this webinar in particular. So firstly, hello everybody, this is me. My name's Anjali. I'm a wine educator at the WSET school in London. And I find this subject in particular that we're going to be looking at today, natural wine, one of the most fascinating and kind of dynamic sides of the wine industry. So I'm really excited to kind of get stuck in and discuss some of this stuff with you. Firstly, a few kind of things that crossed my mind as I was researching this topic. I've done a couple of bite-sized webinars for WSET Global, and this topic on natural wine was by far the trickiest, particularly to kind of get in time and to make sure that I was kind of keeping everything as balanced as possible, I guess. And that's because the question, what is natural wine, is quite a thorny question. It's one that is quite contentious and divisive in the world of wine. And a lot of people have a lot of strong views on them. I would say that the voices at either end of these arguments are generally the loudest. So there's lots of people who have real strong views on exactly what natural wine should constitute. I've had a go at kind of giving it some definitions, summing up the ethos and a few things like that, but you are more than welcome to disagree with me. In fact, that is especially welcome for this subject because it's such an area kind of ripe for debate. A few other kind of things to point out, that the natural wine ethos, from the kind of research I've done, is really widely agreed with across lots of parts of the wine industry. It's the term itself that can cause a few problems, and we'll look at that in the next few slides. And it's that term that, in some ways, arguably, some producers could use it for their own kind of advantage, and we'll look at that too in a little bit more detail. Okay, so some quotes really coming up to keep in mind before we go into the kind of definitions of what natural wine is, which I'm sure you're all very keen to kind of understand. I think some voices in the industry to keep these kind of quotes in the back of your mind as we're looking at some of the definitions and some of the ethos of natural wine. So firstly, our advocates of the term and the category. Firstly, we have Sébastien Riffaut, a winemaker based in the Loire Valley in Sancerre, who says, natural wine, it's not for everyone. It's not made like fast food, but it's totally pure. And then we have Isabelle Legeron, MW, who's the author of a book called Natural Wine, a big advocate of the category, and she says, like sailors going to sea, natural winemakers understand that nature is much greater than themselves. Only natural wine can be truly great. So these are our two advocates. I've also got a couple of quotes from some natural wine, I guess, skeptics or detractors. So firstly, we have Robert Parker, the very famous wine critic, saying natural wine is an undefined scam. And another critic, Michel Betan, there is no definition of natural wine. It exists because it proclaims itself so. It is a fantasy of marginal producers. Now, these are just, I guess, ideas to keep in mind as we go through this webinar, and hopefully by the end of it, you can maybe decide for yourself whether you entirely agree with some of these quotes or none of them. You think it's more kind of somewhere in the middle of what these views are, but just some views to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this webinar. Something else to address, I think this is really regarding the specifics of the term natural wine. And I think this is why the category is so tricky in lots of ways. This word natural has consistently been quite a difficult word across food and drink labelling, and it's no exception for wine. It can be deliberately misleading in that sense, and that's because this image of these beautiful grapes on the slide, humans need to be involved in order to convert these beautiful grapes into wine. And so in lots of senses, if we take the term literally, there can't be such thing as natural wine, because humans need to be involved in the production. And that's why when it comes to the term natural wine, it's likely that the term is going to remain an informal term that you can proclaim yourself to be. And this is where some problems may crop up, which some of the detractors have alluded to. However, there are certifications that may be helpful, which we will also explore in the rest of this webinar, to help you make an informed decision when buying your wine. And because it's a self-proclaimed term, and because the word natural has a lot of marketing cachet, it's a term that many producers, regardless of their ethos, may be keen to use. So it's a term to be a little bit aware of. Whether or not you wholly agree with the ethos, the term natural wine can be a little bit tricky for these reasons. Now, I thought before I present to you the kind of definition that I've kind of put together for natural wine, thought it would be worth looking at why natural wine has come to be, why now, and why it exists. And I think part of it lies in this beautiful image on my slide of this beautiful vineyard. And I think what has happened in recent years is increasing producers and consumers have become aware that when it comes to conventional wine production, this image is not necessarily the reality of large-scale production in wine. And that's certainly been a trend really since the 80s. The 1980s, we've seen huge advances in wine and technology. And largely, these have been really embraced by lots of sides of the wine industry, particularly production. And producers have found themselves able to adjust, or another word maybe correct, their wines like never before. And what this has meant is that producers have been increasingly able to make wines in any desired style, particularly a style that there might be a lot of consumer demand for. Regardless of whether the vineyard or the location that they're growing their grapes in is well suited to this kind of production. Because since the 1980s, there are so many ways you can manipulate your wine into tasting exactly how you want it to, regardless of what the weather was like that year, whereabouts you're growing your grapes. You can make whatever wine you want. And so the emergence of natural wine can be connected to a reaction against the popularity of these kind of heavily manipulated, technically perfect wines in the 90s, 80s and 90s. So these are very much wines that were designed, that were kind of briefed. I want to make a wine that tastes like this. Please, can we work out how to make this wine using various additions, adjustments and processing aids? And the natural wine, I'm hesitant to call it a movement because many within the world of natural wine don't really like you considering it a movement because it is quite disparate. But within the world of natural wine, we can largely see it as a reaction against this style. The popularity or the rise in natural wine can also be arguably connected to a rise in wellness culture, which we see across food and beverage. And an increasing awareness of the climate crisis in the last 10 or 15 years. So this is the place that we're looking out from when we're looking at the rise of natural wine. So that's a little bit about the why. Now, I'm going to get stuck into the ethos of natural wine. And because there's no clear set of criteria to define natural wine, this has all been put together by research that I've done for this webinar, and have kind of looked into the ethos of producers, as well as of what consumers are asking for, retailers, distributors, essentially across the trade, what the ethos kind of seems to end up with. And it is that reaction against this kind of heavily manipulated style. So the natural wine ethos, it sits within the idea that the producer should be working with nature instead of fighting against it. So in the way that Isabelle Legeron, MW, the quote that I had from her at the beginning, that natural winemakers are like sailors on the waves, producers of natural wine should be working alongside what nature throws at them, rather than consistently kind of coming up with ideas, interventions and manipulations to fight against what nature is giving in a particular year. So what this means is as few interventions as possible should be made, both in the vineyard and in the winery, and that these interventions should be physical and not chemical. And some examples there. So a physical intervention might be the choice in utilising skin contact. And by that I mean allowing grape skins to soak in the grape juice, particularly used for white grape varieties. And this might act as a kind of natural stabiliser of the wine, as well as giving the wine some texture. Blending might also be a good example of a physical intervention as opposed to a chemical one. Chemical interventions include things like acidification, so adding acidity to your wine to counteract what you might perceive as a lower level of acidity in the fruit that the growing season has given you, or correcting the colour of the wine, correcting the mouthfeel of the wine with various chemical additions. Another aspect of the natural wine ethos is that the wine should reflect the region and the growing season as far and specifically as possible. And what this means is you can certainly expect within the world of natural wine to experience bottle variation within the same labelled wine year to year, and occasionally even bottle variation along the same wine in the same year. And that's because we want to be doing as little as possible and working with exactly what the elements have given us. And not every growing season is the same. Each year you're going to experience different weather patterns, and that's going to affect the grapes on the vine, the number of them, the ripeness of them, and therefore the style of wine you're going to be creating. So we should expect year to year wine to taste different. And this does really counteract the trend in consistency of wine in the 80s and 90s. This wine has a particular consumer who wants the wine to taste the same every year, and we're going to need to make various adjustments to be able to achieve that. So in order to reflect the region and growing season as far and specifically as possible, this may be at the expense of volume. It may be at the expense of the consistency that we've discussed, and sometimes it may be at the expense or it may include aromas that are more unexpected and not necessarily conventionally desired. It may not, though. These natural wines along this ethos may taste pretty similar to a conventional wine. They may, however, also display aromas that are a little bit more unexpected. So that's the ethos. That's what we're going to be thinking about. If we want to make a natural wine, we want to be essentially making as few interventions as possible. So how do we do that? The practicalities of it, I'm going to explore a little bit in the next slide. And I've just caveated it again by reminding you that there's still no universally agreed definition or fixed set of criteria for natural wine. So the definition or the practicalities I'm going to indicate here are really, after having done some research and finding the elements to natural wine production that really are the most kind of widely agreed. So firstly, the wine needs to be made organically. It needs to be made with minimal or zero adjustments or processing aids. The wine needs to be made using ambient yeasts. This is as opposed to cultured or commercial yeasts. The wine needs to be made with minimal sulfur dioxide and sometimes none at all. I've put this in, it's not necessarily as cut and dry as the other elements, but the wine needs to be fermented and stored in a neutral vessel. And the wine needs to have undergone minimal clarification and filtration. I'm going to break all of these down in the next few slides, but hopefully this already gives you a kind of indication that natural winemakers don't want to do anything that may strip out the character of the wine or manipulate the character of the wine. And that goes right from vineyard all the way through to fermentation and all activities in the winery too. So these are some things to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the webinar, and I'm going to break down some of these particular factors. So firstly, what's going on in the vineyard? Now, as a minimum standard, natural wine, the grapes for natural wine need to be produced organically, and this requires, depending on your certification, wine made without the use of synthetic pesticides, herbicides, or fungicides. And organic viticulture is one perspective on ensuring that the vineyard is viewed as an entire ecosystem and not just as a monoculture. So we don't just have the grapevine growing, we have all sorts of other forms of life within the vineyard that give us an ecosystem and therefore naturally can protect against pests and diseases. The vineyard may be biodynamic as well. Biodynamics include all of the don'ts of organic viticulture, so no pesticides, no herbicides, and no fungicides, as well as some do's as well. So there's some activities to be carried out within biodynamic viticulture. And actually all of the activities or all of the perspectives on this slide could do with their own webinar in and of themselves. So I'm really just going to be touching on them. But biodynamic viticulture, as well as those don'ts of organic viticulture, include things like taking into account homeopathy and carrying out your vineyard activities according to the lunar calendar. Some other vineyard perspectives to keep in mind. Firstly, regenerative viticulture. This is really about making sure that the soil is kept in good health and is not completely depleted by the vine and the crop. It's not a certification, but it's a guide to ensure that the soil and the vineyard is kept in good health and therefore can sustain grape growing for many, many years. And this runs alongside a sustainably made wine, which again, there's a lot of crossover with all of these four perspectives on running a vineyard. The term just sustainably made indicates a lot about organic production, a lot about regenerative viticulture as well, so making sure the soil is kept really healthy, but also taking into account the financial sustainability and the economic sustainability of producing wine. So that's a little bit about what's going on in the vineyard when it comes to natural wine. Now, next, we're going to have a little look at adjustments and processing aids. Now, this is something you still currently cannot find out on the back label of a wine, just how many adjustments and what kind of processing aids have been used to produce these wines. And I'm going to list out for you a few examples of some of these for conventional wine production, but it really doesn't scratch the surface. There is an awful lot of adjustments, awful lot of processing aids that you can use to make wine. So some additions regarding conventional production. So we won't find these additions in natural wine production, and they include acidification, so adding tartaric acid to the wine to raise the level of acidity, adding sugar to the wine, or adding sugar to the grape juice to bump up the final level of alcohol in the wine. You might want to correct the colour of the wine or the mouthfeel. You might want to add some flavour additions, so using something like oak chips to give the indication of a kind of oaky flavour. Some processing aids. The difference here between an adjustment and a processing aid is that a processing aid should not be remaining in the final product. So they're used as a way to get the wine to the final point that you want it to get to. And that includes using fining agents, which include a lot of animal products, such as egg white. To fine a wine means to ensure that your wine is and remains perfectly clear. So you would also use fining agents to make something like a consommé, if you're interested in cooking and cheffery, and we use these products, or conventional wine producers will use these products to ensure that the wine is clear in appearance. Commercial yeast as well may be used to kick off a fermentation, as opposed to using ambient yeasts. We're going to look at that in a bit more detail on the next slide here. So to recap, or to have a little look about how wine is made, I mean, yeast is fundamental. So in order to make wine, we need sugar in our grapes, and via the action of yeast, we're going to convert that sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Now, really, when it comes to still wine production, alcohol is the name of the game here, the most important thing. And it's that yeast that for conventional wine production, we can purchase a cultured yeast in order to allow our fermentation to take place. And a cultured yeast will allow a very reliable fermentation. It will it means that the wine that you're going to be that you will end up with will likely be a more consistent wine that maybe has the aromas that you might specifically are seeking for your wine. Whereas natural wine production will use ambient yeasts. These are yeasts that exist in the vineyard and winery ambiently. And to use these ambient yeasts that exist within the vineyard and winery, this may well mean that the wine that we're going to end up with is a more complex wine. However, ambient yeasts may also make a wine a bit more vulnerable to spoilage as the wine is being produced. So it's more risky to use ambient yeast, but you can really see the benefits in terms of ending up with a much more complex wine. And I guess the best analogy here, because we're using yeast for the same thing, is something like sourdough bread. So sourdough bread is a good example of a bread that uses ambient yeasts, whereas a kind of a packet in a supermarket of sliced white bread, that might be the equivalent of a product that uses cultured yeast. So that would be our conventional wine equivalent, whereas sourdough would be our ambient yeast, our natural wine equivalent. So that's a little bit on yeast. Sulfur dioxide. Now, this is another kind of thorny issue. SO2 or sulfur dioxide is both an addition that you can make, you can add to your wine, and also is a natural byproduct of fermentation. It's widely used across wine production and used to produce wine at all quality levels. The reason it's used is because it's both an antioxidant and an antiseptic. So SO2 will protect your wine from oxidation and may also protect your wine from microbial spoilage. So it acts to protect your wine. And really the accepted level of SO2 added to a wine really quite drastically varies, both from a point of view of conventional wine and natural wine, and even within the natural wine community, the accepted level can really vary between producers. Sulfur dioxide is also an allergen, and as an allergic reaction, it affects 2 to 3% of the population, and the reaction will be respiratory. So the idea that sulfites or sulfur dioxide in wine might give you a headache, that unfortunately there's no evidence for that, but it is an allergen for 2 to 3% of the population, but those side effects will be respiratory, they won't be headaches. Clarification and filtration. So another aspect of our natural wine ethos is we're going to do these minimally. The wine will not be fine, so we're not going to clarify our wine using something like egg white. As producers believe that clarification and filtration may strip the wine of its character. So this means that some natural wine may be cloudy or hazy in appearance. Some will be perfectly clear, but some you might see has potentially some sediment or is a little bit cloudy, and that's because it's been, it may not have been filtered at all. A couple of questions to kind of end with. Firstly, is natural wine better for your health? And I've got bad news, I'm afraid, because the short answer is no. At least there's little evidence to currently support the idea that natural wine is better for your health, but research does evolve. We may find out that actually it is. Currently, there's little evidence to support this idea. This includes sulfites. So as long as you're not allergic, there's nothing to suggest that consuming products within the legally specified range is harmful. And there are far higher levels of sulfites in a packet of dried fruit than there are in wines that we're drinking, even conventionally made wines. So unfortunately, that's not an indicator. Other claims regarding natural wine improving gut health and lessening hangovers, I'm very sorry to say, are also currently unfounded. That's not to say research might kind of throw up some ideas about this, but currently it doesn't seem to be that there are any connections between natural wine and improving your health. Is natural wine better for the environment? Another really important question, I think, and this kind of needs to be broken down a little bit. So wine made without synthetic pesticides, herbicides or fungicides, such as organic or biodynamic viticulture, is less harmful to the environment. This includes things like regenerative viticulture as well, ensuring that soil health is maintained. The longevity of the soil also is much better for the environment. Vineyards that use less machinery may have a lower carbon impact. So if your vineyard activities, whether you're making conventional or natural wine, if you're using less machinery, if you're hand harvesting, for example, rather than machine harvesting, you'll have a lower carbon impact. A few things to point out regarding transport and packaging. Natural wine is still largely packaged in glass, and the method of transportation is rarely considered within the world of natural wine. Both transport and packaging are widely considered to have the most harmful impact on the environment. And as it is currently with natural wine, there is little discussion about both of those factors when it comes to natural wine and its environmental impact. However, certainly in the winery, if we're going along the natural wine ethos, it is much better for the environment to be purchasing wine that's been made without pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. A few words to describe natural wine. Now, these don't necessarily factor into the WSET systematic approach to tasting. They're not necessarily tasting notes that we might see across our qualification. Some of them are, but I kind of wanted to indicate here that a natural wine can taste farmy, funky, cidery, challenging. Certainly they can, but they can also taste elegant, pure, bright, complex, and many words in between. There are just as many words to describe a natural wine as there are to describe kind of wine in general. Natural wine doesn't have a specific set of aromas and flavours, but it can include aromas and flavours that you may not find in conventional wine, and that's down to the way that it may be produced. Some key styles to try. Again, these wines are not necessarily exclusively natural, but they make up a significant part of the natural wine world, the natural wine category. So I've kind of narrowed them down really into affordable sparkling wine, and these might say on the label Pétillant Naturel or Petnat or Col Fondo. These are sparkling wines that will be very characterful, may have some sediment in them, maybe a little bit hazy, and should be quite a bit more affordable than something like champagne. Light-bodied reds, that's another kind of big part of the natural wine category. So sometimes lovingly referred to as glue, to imitate the noise of wine leaving a bottle as it's being poured out. Some examples to try: Gamay from Beaujolais, Gamay from the Loire Valley, Sanso from Swartland in South Africa as well. These are juicy, bright, cranberry, red curranty, chillable red wines, low alcohol as well. And kind of counterintuitively for conventional wine production, we've got lighter reds and more age-worthy, fuller styles of white in the natural wine category. So these include skin contact wine. So this is wine where we've harvested white grape varieties, but we're going to allow those white grape skins to impart some colour, maybe some tannin into the wine. This may otherwise be known as orange wine, and actually I've done a webinar on orange wine, which you can also check out on the Events Hub on the WSET Global YouTube, a little whistle-stop tour of orange wine. Some other styles of white: floor-aged wine and oxidative wine. These are small aspects to the world of natural wine, but certainly these will create a more characterful style of white. Some other styles to try: wine that's been fermented or stored in amphora. This is certainly something that's becoming very popular in the natural wine community. These are traditional clay vessels. And piquette, which I personally am desperate to try. I cannot find it in the UK, and I don't believe you can find it in the EU, but you can find it elsewhere. This is wine made from really the byproduct of wine production. It's wine made from all of the pressed out grape skins. Some water is added to that, and then it's fermented if it needs to be. And this is a really light, fresh, drink, often lower in alcohol, that's really worthwhile. I haven't tasted it, but I'm desperate to. If you have, please let us know in the chat. Let us know what you thought of it. So a little kind of note on packaging to end with. What I want you to do here, we've got 3 wines. I want you to tell me if you can spot the natural wine out of wine number 1, wine number 2, and wine number 3. So wine number 1 is a wine from Vouvray in the Loire by Domaine Huet. Wine number 2 is a sparkling Carignan from California, from Las Jarras. And finally, wine number 3 is a Pinot Blanc from Alsace, Domaine Zind Humbrecht. So hopefully you've made your decision about which one of these is the natural wine. And maybe some of you have spotted that this is a trick question, because these are all natural wines. And a lot of natural wine is kind of known for having really jazzy packaging, which wine number 2 certainly does. Wine number 1 and 3 really look more traditional. They're also much older, more established wineries, but all of these wines have been made with a natural wine ethos. So they don't need to fit one particular bracket natural wine. They can cross a lot of different styles of wine, as we can see here. With that in mind, how can you be sure that the wine you're buying is natural? It's a really tricky thing. By looking at the label, as we can see with that last slide, it's very difficult to tell if a wine is natural, but just by looking at the label, really you've got to research the individual producer. Some certifications can help, so I've put some logos at the side of this slide. These might all indicate that at least part of the natural wine ethos was adhered to in the process of making the wine. I don't think we will likely be getting a natural wine kind of clear, easy certification. And that's partly because it's a relatively tricky thing to define and that lots of people have different views on it. And partly because part of the ethos of natural wine is also a very countercultural mindset. And so a lot of producers don't want to be part of a particular kind of certification or scheme. And that's part of what they're railing against. I'd say that more so than conventional wine, tasting the wine prior to purchasing is valuable, because you can't necessarily guess the style of wine just by looking at the region or the label in a way that you may more likely be able to do with conventional wine. So a real kind of journey through natural wine there. I hope it's been helpful. And given you at least some kind of food for thought and some things to think about. Really, with a subject like this, I feel like I've only scratched the surface really and given quite a broad overview of all of these different aspects to production. A lot of these slides could be webinars in and of themselves, but hopefully we've made a kind of good start. That just leaves me to say thank you. And if you have any questions, we might have a couple of minutes for a few. So I'm just going to bring up our questions here. Is there a specific neutral vessel that is used for storing and fermenting natural wine? There isn't really. I just added that in as something that I've noticed across the natural wine category, but it's not actually so common for producers to really specify that they do or don't use particular vessels. Concrete is quite popular. Very old oak barrels are also quite popular, as well as amphora that we touched on for a particular style. Which countries, except for France, have certifications for natural wine? That is a really good question and quite a tricky question. So France has relatively recently introduced Vin Method Nature, which goes some way into certifying natural wine. When it comes to the ethos, it will really depend on whether this is the vineyard or the winery or both. There are certifications around the world for organic production, and there are also biodynamic certifications. But for specifically natural wine, they're much fewer and further between. France really is the first kind of country and the biggest kind of producer of this style, the kind of pioneer of this style. By ambient, do you mean natural yeast fermentation? Yeah, that is what I mean. So what I mean by using ambient yeast is not adding a specific cultured yeast, allowing the yeast that exists in the atmosphere to carry out the fermentation, much as you would do if you were making sourdough bread. How can we educate consumers more on climate and vintage variation? I think this is a really good question. And I think actually it's already changing, and lots of natural wine producers are going a really good way to educate consumers that consistency is not necessarily hugely achievable when it comes to a product that is grown annually, depending on the growing season. So I think we're kind of already getting there. Hopefully webinars like this, hopefully understanding a little bit more about how how wine is made will help all consumers. So whether that's taking a qualification, or whether that's visiting producers, asking them questions, going to wine bars, asking your servers questions, all of these things are really helpful. Last couple of questions. Are you expecting a huge increase in popularity of natural wine in the next few years? I think it's growing and will continue to grow, yeah, particularly in the UK. There are various pockets that have started out with it. I also think the overall quality of natural wine will increase hugely in the next few years as things kind of iron themselves out a little bit. The final question, do you think the natural wine ethos will eventually consider packaging? I really do hope that. I think it's a really important part of the kind of conscientiousness and consciousness of natural wine, that it brings so much to the vineyard. I really hope we see that extended to packaging, but a lot of that lies in the consumer, and making sure that the consumer is happy purchasing wine, maybe not in a heavy glass bottle, and maybe in an alternative format. Another big question that maybe will become an entirely different webinar in and of itself. Just one final question that I've spotted here: the difference between natural wine and orange wine. That's a really good question. We touched on it a little bit, but do check out the orange wine webinar that I hosted a few months ago. It really goes from start to finish in the production of orange wine, so you'll be able to see how that's different to the natural wines that we've discussed here. Thank you so much for coming along to this presentation, everyone, and I hope you've all learned a little bit about natural wine. Hope you're all excited to taste some. There's a poll that's popped up on your screen. Please fill that out if you can, and that just leaves me to say thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.